So you mentioned a lot about the feedback and knowing how to pace yourself. Is the treatment landscape changing much at all? And where do you see the research needs to be focused for this condition?
I have been very disappointed by the sense of urgency, lack of sense of urgency to treat this condition. I think, it's been very difficult because we all want the pandemic to be over and we want to just move on because it was a very difficult time at the beginning of the pandemic for everyone to be, shutting a lot of things down and minimizing social interaction and that sort of thing. And we're all just so set on getting back to life as usual that in my view, we have conflated the pandemic ending with the long COVID mass disabling event ending. And very few long COVID patients are recovering. There was just a paper this week that said about 8% of folks recover in the first 2 years. So this is just, as far as we know, a very long-term syndrome that we don't have good solutions for at all. And so in my mind, we should be focusing now on clinical trials. And there are many candidates, some of which we have in our review, but there are even more resources that have come out since we published that review in January talking about what candidates we should be testing. There are just now starting to be some trials, which, in my view is very late given that we're over 3 years into the pandemic, but there are, a couple hundred now on clinicaltrials.gov, but most are very small sample size, 100 at most. Mm-hmm. Some are 20 or 40. And so those are not going to be well powered enough to really impact care on a large scale. And those results probably won't be in for a year or two. And so I remain concerned that we are not doing enough with the clinical trials to be able to treat people in the near term. I often say, since I first got long COVID, I've been saying, I think we're 5 years away from having good treatments. And I think we're probably still 5 years away from having solid treatments. The other challenge with the small sample sizes now is we talked about the subgroup effects, that I expect that there are going to be some things that work for some patients and some things that work for others. And so we need well-powered studies to be able to capture those differences and understand which symptom presentation can be addressed with which treatment.
So as COVID evolved, we saw different variants and then ultimately the institution of effective vaccines. Have you been able to determine any significant differences between the variants and which ones may predispose to developing long COVID? And have we seen benefit of the vaccines, for that matter, in preventing the development or the severity of long COVID?
The biggest change has been the vaccines, for sure, decreasing the prevalence of long COVID, which is wonderful to see. Unfortunately, the vaccines weren't available when I and many others contracted it, but it's an added benefit that when I'm talking to someone about getting vaccinated, I definitely mention that. We've also seen some trials, like the metformin trial, for example, reducing the risk of long COVID if you take it in the acute phase. And so I hope to see more things like that to be preventing long COVID in general. The difference between the variants is kind of difficult to ascertain because there are so many other things that were conflating the data. So I don't see that as a huge effect in the past, but I don't rule out the possibility that we could have a variant in the future that changes the prevalence of long COVID for better or for worse.
I know we touched on this a little bit earlier, but like so many other things in healthcare, we did see disparities in the populations affected by COVID and now also by long COVID. And you mentioned some of the reasons why that's going to be difficult to study. Any other thoughts to explore in that area of disparities? Is it the social determinants of health that's the main thing? Is it the virus itself? What do you think?
Absolutely. We've seen, larger prevalence of COVID cases in certain groups, like, for example, Black and Hispanic communities were struck more by COVID in the beginning. And so it's not surprising now that we're seeing a larger prevalence of long COVID in those communities as well. I worry the most about those that, one, are unable to access the healthcare system or don't have access to good quality of care. And two, those that are more financially dependent on physical exertion for their jobs. So for me, I sit at home all day and I can, lay down whenever I need to, essentially. Right. But if I had a job where I was on my feet, I absolutely would not be able to keep my job. And so I think the disparities based on the type of work that you do, as well as racial and ethnic identity, are very crucial and also understudied. I think as we come up with the different treatments, we will need to make a real effort to make sure that we are both diagnosing and treating all who are affected by the disease, and the physician education piece will be a really important component of that.